In Denver International Airport, a 72-year-old veteran was about to face his most humiliating battle. What started as a routine trip to his granddaughter's wedding took a shocking turn when he came face to face with a TSA system that stripped away his dignity. Colonel Tom Cruise wasn't your typical passenger. For 30 years, he had served his country, known for his Medal of Honor and unwavering character. When Agent Marcus Thompson conducted an invasive strip search, Tom had no idea he was walking into a national controversy. His quiet compliance would lead to congressional hearings and institutional reform. What began as a family celebration would become a movement for change. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's mechanical buzz cut through the pre-dawn. Silence at precisely 0500 hours, just as it had every morning for the past 47 years. Colonel Tom Cruise's eyes opened immediately. No gradual awakening, no disorientation. The habits of a lifetime of military service ran deeper than sleep. He lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his house settling around him. 2 years now since Margaret's breathing had filled this space beside him. 2 years since her gentle snoring had provided the counterpoint to his own restless nights. The phantom limb pain in his left leg was already announcing itself, a dull throb that would sharpen once he began moving. The morning ritual began with the same methodical precision he'd brought to every dawn since returning from Southeast Asia. Pills first, 3 white tablets for the phantom pain, 1 blue for blood pressure, half a yellow one for the heart condition he pretended didn't worry him. Margaret used to arrange them in a small dish each evening, a gesture of love disguised as practicality. Now he set them out himself, each bottle returning to its exact position in the medicine cabinet. The prosthetic leg waited in its stand. Beside the bed, titanium and polymer engineering that had replaced flesh and bone torn apart by shrapnel outside Da Nang in 1971. He'd been dragging 3 wounded soldiers to safety when the mortar round landed. Lost the leg, saved the men. The Medal of Honor citation used words like conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life. Tom remembered mostly the sound, that peculiar wet thump when metal met meat, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the world. 40 minutes later, showered and dressed in his best civilian clothes, navy slacks, white shirt, the blue tie Margaret had given him for their 50th anniversary, he stood before the display case in his study. The Medal of Honor rested in its velvet-lined box, the star-shaped pendant catching the morning light. Beside it, photographs chronicled a life of service. His commissioning photo from West Point, snapshots from Vietnam, his retirement ceremony after 30 years in the Army, decades of teaching high school history to kids who saw war as something from video games. His fingers traced the frame, holding his favorite picture of Elena. She was 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing his old combat helmet that nearly swallowed her head. She'd spent that summer with him and Margaret while her parents tried to rebuild their marriage. It hadn't worked. David had come back from Afghanistan, carrying wounds that couldn't be seen on X-rays. The divorce had been ugly, bitter. Elena's father had never quite forgiven Tom for being the kind of soldier who'd come home whole, at least on the surface. David's death 5 years later, officially a motorcycle accident, though the empty bottle of bourbon and the curve he'd taken at 90 miles per hour told a different story, had brought Elena back into their lives permanently. Tom had been the one to teach her to drive, to walk her through calculus homework, to sit in the front row at her law school graduation. Margaret had provided the mothering. Tom had been the anchor, steady and reliable as the sunrise. Now Eleanor was getting married, and Tom was traveling alone for the first time since Margaret's funeral. The black suit hanging in his closet felt like a uniform from another war, formal, necessary, but somehow foreign to the man he'd become. The drive to Denver International Airport took 43 minutes, traffic lighter than expected. Tom had allowed an hour and a half, the military man's compulsion to arrive early for any mission. He'd driven himself, despite Elena's offers to arrange transportation, needing the familiar comfort of controlling his own movement. Independence was one of the few things left that he could command absolutely. DIA sprawled before him like a small city, its white tent-like peaks reaching toward the Colorado sky. The terminal teemed with travelers, families dragging oversized suitcases, business travelers glued to phones, young couples holding hands and sharing earbuds. Tom moved through the crowd with the measured pace his prosthetic required, his carry-on, a bag containing 3 days' worth of clothes and medications, plus the small velvet box holding Margaret's engagement ring. Elena didn't know he planned to give it to her after the ceremony. The TSA checkpoint stretched ahead like a checkpoint he'd manned in a dozen different countries. Tom understood the necessity, respected the mission. He'd seen enough genuine threats to appreciate the work these young agents did, standing between safety and chaos. The line moved efficiently, passengers shuffling forward with practiced resignation. "Good morning, sir." The TSA agent was young, maybe late 20s, with earnest eyes behind regulation glasses. His nameplate read, Thompson, M. "Destination today?" "Chicago," Tom replied, offering his identification and boarding pass. "My granddaughter's wedding." Thompson smiled, the genuine expression of someone still finding pleasure in his work. "Congratulations, sir. Place your items in the bins and step through when I signal." Tom removed his belt, his shoes, his watch, the ritual of modern travel. That would have seemed absurd to the young lieutenant who'd once walked point through jungle trails. He placed his medal case in a separate bin, watching Thompson's eyes register the distinctive blue ribbon and star. "Thank you for your service, sir," Thompson said quietly. Tom nodded, appreciating the young man's sincerity. He'd grown tired of the reflexive gratitude that felt more like social obligation than genuine recognition. But something in Thompson's voice suggested personal connection to military service. The metal detector waited ahead, an electronic sentry that would judge whether he posed a threat to his fellow travelers. Tom stepped forward when signaled, raising his arms in the familiar pose of surrender that security demanded. He'd done this dozens of times before, the prosthetic always triggering additional screening. The machine emitted its sharp, insistent beep. Thompson's expression shifted subtly, professional courtesy replacing casual friendliness. "Sir, I'll need you to step to the side for additional screening. Standard procedure for medical devices." Tom moved to the designated area, familiar with the protocol. Around him, the morning flow of travelers continued, businessmen checking watches, mothers corralling children, everyone eager to reach their destinations. He waited patiently as Thompson consulted with a supervisor, a middle-aged woman whose badge identified her as Walsh, J. The supervisor's eyes flicked over Tom's appearance, taking in his age, his bearing, the careful way he stood to favor his prosthetic leg. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but Tom caught something in her posture, the rigid stance of someone more concerned with following procedures than understanding their purpose. "Additional screening required," she told Thompson. "Full protocol." Thompson nodded, his earlier warmth replaced by mechanical efficiency. "Sir, I'll need to escort you to a private screening area. This is standard procedure for prosthetic devices that trigger our detection systems." Tom felt the first stirring of unease, though he couldn't identify its source. Something in Walsh's tone, perhaps, or the way other passengers were beginning to notice the delay. He'd been through additional screening before, but it had always been handled with discretion, respect for his service and his dignity. "Of course," he said, gathering his belongings. "I understand you have procedures to follow." as Thompson led him toward a windowless room marked Private Screening. Tom caught sight of his reflection in the terminal's glass walls. An old man in his best clothes, moving carefully on an artificial leg, following a young agent who looked like he might have been one of Tom's students. The image troubled him in a way he couldn't name. Behind them, the metal detector's alarm fell silent, but the sound seemed to echo in Tom's mind as the door to the screening room closed with a solid, final click. The door clicked shut behind them with the finality of a cell door. Agent Marcus Thompson moved with practiced efficiency, his hands steady despite the tremor of anxiety that had been his constant companion since starting this job 6 months ago. The private screening room felt smaller than usual, fluorescent, lights casting harsh shadows across institutional grey walls. A single metal table, 2 plastic chairs that looked borrowed from a school cafeteria. Colonel Tom Cruise stood at attention without realizing it, decades of military bearing manifesting automatically in unfamiliar territory. He watched Thompson's movements, noting the young man's nervousness in the way he adjusted his glasses. Twice in 30 seconds, the slight hesitation before reaching for his equipment. "Sir, I'm going to need you to remove your shoes and socks," Thompson said, his voice carrying the rehearsed quality of recently memorized procedures. "Then I'll need to examine your prosthetic device." Tom complied without complaint, settling into one of the plastic chairs to manage the complex process of removing his shoe and sock from the prosthetic foot. The mechanism was sophisticated, a far cry from the crude wooden peg his grandfather had worn after losing his leg in Korea, but it still required careful attention. Thompson watched the process with clinical interest, probably the first time he'd seen a modern prosthetic up close. "My grandfather lost his leg too," Thompson said suddenly, then caught himself. "I'm sorry, sir, that was unprofessional." "Nothing wrong with conversation," Tom replied, surprising himself with his desire to put the young agent at ease. "Korea? Vietnam, actually. He never talked about it much." Thompson's voice carried a weight that spoke of family stories told in fragments, half-truths, designed to protect the living from the dead's darker truths. Tom nodded, understanding. His own stories to Elena had been carefully edited, stripped of the screaming and the blood, the way dying men called for their mothers in languages he didn't recognize. "We didn't talk about it much back then. Different time." Thompson began his examination of the prosthetic, running his hands along the titanium shaft with professional thoroughness. His touch was respectful but thorough, checking joints and attachment points for anything that might conceal prohibited items. Tom appreciated the young man's careful attention. This was how security should work, methodical but human. "I'm going to need to use the wand detector on your prosthetic, sir," Thompson continued. "Standard procedure." The handheld metal detector screamed its electronic protest as it passed over the titanium and steel components. Multiple alerts, each one sharper than the last. Thompson frowned, running the device over the same areas repeatedly, as if hoping for different results. From outside the screening room came the sound of normal airport life, announcements echoing. Through the terminal, the rumble of wheeled luggage, children's voices raised in excitement or complaint. Inside this windowless box, time seemed suspended. "Sir, I'm getting multiple alerts from your device," Thompson said, consulting a laminated card covered in small print. "Protocol requires additional screening." Something in his tone had changed. The human warmth was being replaced by institutional distance, the transformation Tom had seen in young soldiers when they first learned to follow orders without question. It was necessary for military discipline, but here it felt wrong. "I have documentation," Tom offered, reaching for his wallet. "Medical records, TSA approval letters." "Sir, please keep your hands visible," Thompson interrupted, his voice sharper now. "I need you to follow my instructions exactly." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. In 30 years of military service, He'd never been spoken to with such suspicion. He'd commanded men in combat, taught teenagers to think critically about history, carried the Medal of Honor with quiet pride. Now this young man, who looked like he could have been one of his students, was treating him like a threat. Through the small window in the door, Tom could see other passengers moving through. The checkpoint with routine efficiency. A businessman in an expensive suit sailed through without a second glance. A young mother with 2 toddlers received smiling assistance from another agent. An elderly woman with a walker was helped through the metal detector with careful courtesy. "Sir, I'm going to need you to remove your shirt," Thompson said, reading from his protocol card. "Full upper body inspection is required when multiple alerts are detected." Tom's hands stilled on his collar. "Son, I've been through dozens of these screenings. This seems excessive. Sir, I need you to comply with security procedures." Thompson's voice carried a new edge, the authority of someone who'd been told that any resistance was suspicious. "Please remove your shirt." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Tom slowly unbuttoned his white dress shirt, the one Margaret had bought him for their anniversary, the one he'd planned to wear when walking Elena down the aisle. Underneath, his undershirt revealed the topography of an old soldier's body, surgical scars from the leg amputation, shrapnel marks across his ribs, the pale line where a North Vietnamese bullet had creased his shoulder in 1970. Thompson's eyes widened slightly at the constellation of old wounds, but his voice remained steady. "Sir, I need you to remove the undershirt as well." "This is unnecessary," Tom said quietly, but his hands were already moving to comply. 47 years of following orders, of trusting the system, of believing that institutions existed to protect rather than humiliate. As the undershirt came off, exposing his scarred torso to the harsh lights, Tom caught sight of his reflection in the metal surface of the examination table. An old man, half naked, missing a leg, surrounded by institutional grey walls, while a young agent processed him like a potential terrorist. The door opened suddenly, and Supervisor Walsh stepped inside, her expression carefully neutral. She took in the scene. The elderly veteran half-dressed, the nervous agent consulting his procedures, the pile of documentation Tom had been trying to offer. "How much longer?" she asked Thompson, not Tom. "Still multiple alerts on the prosthetic," Thompson replied, "following full protocol." Walsh nodded briskly. "Make sure you document everything. We can't afford any complaints about incomplete screening." The door closed again, leaving Tom alone with Thompson and the growing realization that his dignity was being systematically stripped away in the name of security. Outside, he could hear the faint sound of someone taking pictures with a cell phone, the distinctive electronic shutter click that had become the soundtrack of modern life. "Sir," Thompson said, his voice now completely devoid of warmth, "I'm going to need you to remove your pants." The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, marking the moment when Tom Cruise, Medal of Honor recipient, retired colonel, beloved grandfather, became something else entirely in the eyes of an institution he'd spent his life serving. The electronic shutter sound had been real. Outside the screening room, passenger Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the TSA supervisor, lowered her phone with trembling hands. She'd been waiting in the security line when she noticed the commotion, the way other agents kept glancing toward the private screening room with uncomfortable expressions. When she'd glimpsed through the small window, she'd seen an elderly man in his underwear, scarred and dignified, standing before a young agent like a prisoner awaiting execution. The video was already uploading to her Twitter account before she'd fully processed what she'd witnessed. 300 miles away in Chicago, Elena Cruz Foster stood in her childhood bedroom, now transformed into wedding headquarters, surrounded by bridesmaids, dress bags, and the controlled chaos of pre-wedding preparation. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend, Sarah. "Check Twitter, now. Medal of Honor disrespected." Elena's fingers moved automatically, muscle memory navigating to the trending hashtag. The first video was grainy, shot through what appeared to be a window, but the image was unmistakable. Her grandfather, her rock, her hero, the man who'd raised her after her father's death, standing nearly naked in what was clearly an airport security room. The phone slipped from her hands, clattering against the hardwood floor. Elena. Her maid of honor, Jessica, looked up from the flower arrangement scattered across the bed. "What's wrong?" Elena couldn't speak. The room spun around her as she retrieved the phone, watching the video again, hoping she'd been mistaken. But there was no mistaking those shoulders, that posture, the careful way he stood to favor his prosthetic leg. 47,000 views already. The comments section filling with outrage, analysis, political opportunism. This is what we do to our heroes. TSA thugs strike again. That man saved lives in Vietnam, and this is how we treat him. Someone needs to lose their job over this. Her wedding dress hung in the corner, ivory silk and intricate beadwork that had taken 6 months to perfect. Tomorrow was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Instead, she was watching her grandfather's dignity being stripped away, one electronic share at a time. Across the country, TSA Director Sarah Chen was experiencing the particular hell reserved for crisis managers who learn about disasters through social media. Her deputy director's call had interrupted Tommy's debate team practice, where she'd been watching her 17-year-old son argue passionate points about civil liberties and government overreach. The irony wouldn't hit her until later. "Ma'am, we have a situation in Denver." Deputy Director Martinez's voice carried the tight control of someone delivering catastrophic news. Elderly veteran, Medal of Honor recipient, invasive screening that's gone viral. The footage is bad. Sarah closed her eyes, already seeing the congressional hearings, the budget fights, the political grandstanding that would follow. How bad? Strip search, prosthetic leg. Someone recorded it through the screening room window. Twitter's exploding. Were Medal of Honor disrespected is trending nationally. In the auditorium, Tommy was making an impassioned argument about the balance between security and dignity, his young voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd never had to choose between ideals and institutional reality. Sarah watched him gesture emphatically, remembering when she'd possessed that same unwavering moral clarity. Her phone buzzed with a text from her communications director. CNN wants a statement in 20 minutes. Fox News is already running the story. We need damage control now. Back in Denver, Agent Marcus Thompson was discovering that following protocol perfectly could still result in catastrophic failure. His supervisor's voice crackled through his earpiece as he completed the most thorough and humiliating screening of his 6-month career. "Thompson, wrap it up." Walsh's voice carried new urgency. "Media's calling, questions about our procedures." Through the screening room's small window, Marcus could see unusual activity in the terminal. More agents moving with purpose, supervisors clustered in urgent conversation, passengers slowing their progress to stare and whisper. His hands shook slightly as he helped Colonel Cruz reassemble his dignity. Prosthetic reattached, clothes returned, documentation finally examined. "Sir, you're cleared for travel," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I apologize for the thoroughness of the screening." Tom Cruise stood fully dressed again, but something fundamental had changed. His military bearing remained intact, but there was a new awareness in his eyes, the recognition that the institutions he'd trusted could treat him as an enemy. He gathered his belongings with the same methodical precision he'd displayed earlier. But now, each movement carried the weight of profound disillusionment. "You were following orders," Tom said quietly, and Marcus heard in those words both forgiveness and condemnation. "I understand about following orders." As Tom emerged from the screening room, the terminal's atmosphere had shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Cell phones appeared, recording his exit. He walked toward his gate with as much dignity as he could muster, but the whispers followed him like shrapnel fragments working their way to the surface. "That's him. Can you believe it? My dad served in Vietnam too. This is exactly what's wrong with this country." Jennifer Walsh, the passenger, who'd recorded the original video, approached him hesitantly. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I recorded what happened to you. I've already posted it online. People need to see how our veterans are being treated." Tom nodded, understanding that his private humiliation had become public property. "What's done is done," he said simply. By the time his flight boarded, Shy Medal of Honor disrespected had been shared 17,000 times. Cable news producers were scrambling to book segments. Veteran advocacy groups were crafting press releases. Political operatives were calculating angles. Elena's phone rang as she stood surrounded by the detritus of wedding preparation. Flowers, fabric, dreams suddenly made secondary to the larger fight ahead. "Grandpa?" Her voice cracked on the single word. "Sweetheart." His voice carried a weariness she'd never heard before. "I'm afraid I'm going to be a little famous by the time I get to Chicago." Elena looked at her wedding dress, then at her laptop screen showing the video that had already changed everything. "The wedding can wait, Grandpa. Right now, we have work to do." The plane carrying Colonel Tom Cruise toward Chicago lifted off from Denver International Airport, carrying with it a story that would force an entire nation to confront uncomfortable questions about honor, dignity, and the distance between the America soldiers fought for and the one they returned to find. Below, in the terminal, Agent Marcus Thompson sat in an empty break room, staring at his hands and wondering when following. The rules had become more important than treating people with basic human decency. Director Sarah Chen's government sedan cut through Denver traffic with the efficiency of someone who understood that every minute of delay would be measured in congressional hearing questions and career-ending headlines. She'd made the calculation. During the 40-minute flight from Washington, this crisis required her physical presence, not the careful distance of bureaucratic damage control. The phone hadn't stopped ringing. Her communications director, the Secretary of Homeland Security, 3 different congressional committee chairs. Each conversation had followed the same pattern: outrage, demands for explanations, barely concealed, threats about budget hearings and confirmation battles. But it was Tommy's text that had cut deepest. "Mom, how could you let this happen? That man is a hero." 17 years old and already disappointed in the institutions his mother served. Sarah wondered when she'd stopped seeing the individual faces behind the policies, when enhanced security procedures had become more important than the dignity of the people those procedures were supposed to protect. Denver International Airport buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with normal travel. News vans lined the pickup area, their satellite dishes reaching toward gray Colorado skies. Reporters stood in carefully arranged clusters, practicing sound bites while their producers worked phones and laptops with frantic intensity. Inside Terminal A, Sarah moved through a security checkpoint that had become a crime scene of institutional failure. The same metal detectors, the same X-ray machines, the same blue uniformed agents, but now everything carried the weight of public scrutiny. Passengers moved through with extra attention to the process, some recording their own interactions, as if documenting evidence. Supervisor Janet Walsh met her at the security office, her 20-year career suddenly feeling like a liability rather than an asset. "Ma'am," Agent Thompson followed protocol exactly. Every step documented, every procedure by the book. Sarah studied Walsh's face, reading the defensive posture of someone more concerned with avoiding responsibility than understanding what had gone wrong. "Show me the documentation." The paperwork was immaculate. Thompson had followed the technical, Screening protocol for medical devices with textbook precision. Multiple metal detector alerts required enhanced screening. Enhanced screening required private room examination. Private room examination protocols demanded thorough inspection of any device that triggered repeated alarms. "Where's Thompson now?" Sarah asked. "Administrative leave, pending investigation. Union rep says he's not talking to anyone without representation." Walsh's tone carried the bitter satisfaction of someone watching a subordinate take the fall. "Kid's been nothing but trouble since he started. Too emotional, too invested in the job." Sarah looked up sharply. "Too invested in the job. Comes from military family. His father died in Iraq. Thompson thinks every veteran deserves special treatment." Walsh shrugged. "Can't run security based on feelings." The conference room, where Sarah met Colonel Tom Cruise, overlooked the main terminal, where normal life continued its flow while their private drama played out behind closed doors. Tom sat with military straightness despite his obvious exhaustion, his hands folded precisely in his lap, his eyes carrying the particular wariness of someone whose trust in institutions had been recently and thoroughly shattered. "Colonel Cruise, I want to start by offering my personal apology," Sarah began, meaning every word while knowing how inadequate they sounded. "What happened to you today represents a failure of our system and our training." Tom's response was measured, controlled. "Director Chen, I've spent 50 years trusting that the institutions I served would treat veterans with basic dignity. That trust has been challenged today." His voice carried no anger, which somehow made his words more devastating than any shouted accusation. Sarah found herself thinking of her own father, a Marine who'd served in the Pacific. How would she feel watching him subjected to such treatment? The agent involved, Marcus Thompson, was following established protocols, Sarah continued, choosing her words carefully. But protocols that lead to this kind of result need to be re-examined. "The young man was doing his job," Tom said quietly. "I don't hold him responsible for a system that treats service members as potential threats." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent text from her deputy, Elena Cruz Foster, requesting immediate meeting. She's a civil rights attorney, coming with legal team. Through the conference room windows, Sarah watched a black SUV pull up to the terminal entrance. A young woman emerged, late 20s, dark hair pulled back in the severe style of someone who meant business. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the family resemblance in her bearing. The same straight-backed pride that her grandfather displayed. Elena Cruz Foster moved through the terminal like a force of nature, her legal team flanking her with the precision of a military formation. Passengers recognized her from the news coverage that had exploded across every major network. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some approached with expressions of support, others simply stared with the fascination reserved for celebrities and disasters. The reunion between grandfather and granddaughter took place in a glass-walled conference room under the watching eyes of airport security, TSA officials, and the media camped outside. Elena's composure cracked the moment she saw Tom, her professional armor falling away as she embraced the man who'd raised her. "Grandpa, I'm so sorry. I should have been here. I should have—" "You had a wedding to prepare for," Tom interrupted gently. "This isn't your fight." Elena pulled back, her eyes blazing with an intensity that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of her own son's idealistic fury. "It became my fight the moment they decided to humiliate you. This isn't just about what happened today. It's about how this country treats the people who've sacrificed everything for it." Captain David Rodriguez arrived 20 minutes later, his wheelchair no barrier to the commanding presence he brought into any room. Sarah watched him navigate the terminal with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades fighting institutional indifference, pausing only to speak with reporters who thrust microphones in his direction. Tom. Dave's voice carried the weight of shared history, of battles fought together and losses mourned in the darkness of individual nights. Hell of a way to make the news. Wasn't exactly the plan, Tom replied, but Sarah caught the relief in his voice. Whatever was coming next, he wouldn't face it alone. Dave's eyes found Sarah's across the conference room, and she saw in them the calculating intelligence of someone who understood how to turn individual injustice into systematic change. "Director Chen, I presume, we need to talk." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. Elena laid out the legal framework for a civil rights lawsuit. Dave outlined the political pressure that veteran advocacy groups could bring to bear. Tom sat quietly, the eye of a storm that was growing larger by the hour. Outside, the first congressional statement had been released. Senator Patricia Hawthorne, chair of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, demanded immediate hearings into TSA procedures. Cable news had shifted into full coverage mode, with panels of experts dissecting every aspect of the incident. As the meeting concluded, Sarah found herself facing a choice that would define her tenure as director. She could circle the wagons, protect the agency, and weather the political storm with minimal changes, or she could acknowledge that this moment demanded something more. A fundamental re-examination of how security agencies balanced protection with human dignity. Elena's parting words removed any ambiguity. "Director Chen, my grandfather didn't spend 30 years serving this country to be treated like a terrorist in his old age. We can do this the easy way, with genuine reform and accountability. Or we can do it the hard way, in federal court and congressional hearings. Your choice." Ayo. As the Cruz family departed for their hotel, the wedding postponed indefinitely, Sarah stood at the conference room window watching their convoy disappear into Denver traffic. Her reflection stared back at her, a career government official who'd climbed every ladder and checked every box, now facing the possibility that doing the right thing might cost her everything she'd worked to achieve. Her phone buzzed with another text from Tommy. "Saw the news conference. Proud of you for meeting with them. Don't let the bureaucrats win." Sometimes, Sarah realized, the choice between institutional loyalty and moral leadership wasn't a choice at all. The hotel suite had been transformed into a war room by dawn. Captain Dave Rodriguez commanded the operation from behind a laptop that seemed incongruously small in his weathered hands, while Elena paced the perimeter like a caged lawyer, her phone constantly buzzing with calls from civil rights organizations, veteran advocacy groups, and media outlets that had caught wind of the story's expanding implications. Tom sat in the corner armchair, still processing the surreal transformation of his private humiliation into a national cause. The morning news shows had led with his story. CNN was running a banner, "Medal of Honor, Recipient, strip-searched by TSA." Fox News had found 3 retired generals willing to express outrage on camera. MSNBC was already booking panels about institutional discrimination against veterans. 63 similar incidents in the past 18 months, Dave announced, reading from his screen. That's what Rebecca Chase found in her preliminary research. 63 veterans subjected to invasive screening procedures that wouldn't be applied to regular passengers. Most of them elderly, most with visible disabilities, or prosthetics. Elena stopped pacing. "We have a pattern of discrimination. We have a story," Dave corrected. "Now we need to decide what story we want to tell." The knock on the door interrupted their strategy session. Elena checked the peephole, then opened it to reveal a woman in her early 40s carrying a recorder. and wearing the focused expression of someone who'd spent years hunting institutional corruption. Rebecca Chase, Washington Post. She extended her hand to Tom first, the gesture of someone who understood hierarchy and respect. Colonel Cruz, I'm sorry about what happened to you. I'd like to help make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Dave's wheelchair moved forward with surprising speed. Rebecca, didn't expect to see you this far from the Beltway. Dave Rodriguez, should have known you'd be in the middle of this. Rebecca's smile carried genuine warmth. Still fighting the good fight, I see. Elena watched the exchange with interest. You two know each other. Rebecca broke the VA hospital scandal 2 years ago, Dave explained. Exposed how veterans were dying on waiting lists while administrators falsified records to collect bonuses. Won a Pulitzer for it. Rebecca settled into the chair across from Tom, her recorder visible but not intrusive. Colonel, before we discuss what happened yesterday, I need you to understand something. This story is bigger than one incident at one airport. I've been tracking a pattern of how federal agencies treat veterans, particularly elderly veterans with disabilities. Your case isn't unique. It's just the one that got recorded. Tom felt something shift inside him, the recognition that his personal trauma had become a symbol for something larger. How many others? That's what I'm trying to find out. Rebecca leaned forward. But I need your help, your voice, your willingness to make this about more than just what happened to you. Eleanor's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, then answered with the crisp professionalism that had made her reputation in civil rights law. Elena Cruz Foster. Yes, Senator Hawthorne, I saw your statement. No, my grandfather won't be issuing any statements without legal counsel present. Thursday for the hearing? We'll be there. She ended the call and turned to the room. Senator Patricia Hawthorne wants Grandpa to testify at emergency hearings on TSA procedures. Thursday morning. Dave's expression darkened. Hawthorne's a grandstander. She'll use Tom's testimony to score political points, then bury any real reform in committee. Then we need to be smarter than she is, Elena replied. We control the narrative, not her. Rebecca had been taking notes throughout the exchange. Colonel, are you prepared for what comes next? Once you testify, you become a public figure. Every aspect of your life becomes fair game for political operatives and media scrutiny. Tom thought of Margaret, who'd spent 47 years married to a man who preferred quiet service to public recognition. She'd never sought the spotlight, never wanted their personal struggles aired for public consumption. But she'd also never walked away from a fight that mattered. What do you need me to do? He asked. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in strategic communication. Dave outlined the political landscape, which senators could be counted on for support, which ones would use the hearings for partisan advantage, which committee staff members had genuine interest in reform versus those protecting institutional interests. Elena worked the legal angle, identifying specific TSA policies that violated civil rights protections, building the framework for litigation that could force systematic change rather than cosmetic adjustments. Rebecca provided the media strategy, explaining how congressional testimony could be crafted to reach beyond the hearing room to the millions of Americans who would watch clips on evening news and social media. The key is authenticity. She explained, don't try to be a politician. Be yourself, a soldier, a teacher, a grandfather who got treated badly by a system that should honor your service. Tom's phone rang, interrupting the strategy session. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer. Colonel Cruz, this is Marcus Thompson, the TSA agent from yesterday. Sir, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. The room fell silent. Elena reached for the phone, her lawyer instincts kicking in, but Tom waved her off. "Where are you, son?" "Administrative leave. Union says I shouldn't talk to anyone, but Colonel, I can't sleep. I keep seeing your face when I told you to remove your shirt. My grandfather served in Vietnam. He had shrapnel scars, just like yours. I treated you like a criminal, and I can't live with that." Tom closed his eyes, remembering the young man's nervous energy, the way he'd mentioned his grandfather's service before professionalism took over. "Marcus, you were following orders. I understand about following orders." "Sir, that's just it. I wasn't just following orders. I was hiding behind them. There were a dozen ways I could have handled that screening with more dignity, more respect. But I was scared of my supervisor, scared of making a mistake, scared of being blamed if I didn't follow protocol exactly." Elena was gesturing frantically, mouthing, "Don't say anything incriminating." Dave leaned forward, his expression intense. Rebecca had her recorder ready, but Tom was remembering another young soldier, scared and far from home, who'd frozen during his first firefight until an older sergeant had talked him through it. Sometimes courage meant following orders. Sometimes it meant knowing when not. "Marcus, are you willing to tell the truth about what happened, all of it?" "Yes, sir, even if it cost me my job." Tom looked around the room at the faces of people who'd made his fight their own. His granddaughter, ready to sacrifice her wedding and her time for justice. Dave, channeling decades of institutional frustration into strategic action. Rebecca, turning individual trauma into systematic investigation. "Then we'll tell it together," Tom said, "the whole truth. What happened, why it happened, and how we make sure it doesn't happen again." As Marcus Thompson's voice cracked with relief and gratitude, Tom Cruise felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death, the sense that his life still had purpose, that his story wasn't ending, but evolving into something larger than personal loss and institutional humiliation. Outside the hotel window, Denver stretched toward the mountains, indifferent to the human drama playing out in one of its towers. But inside that room, a Medal of Honor recipient was discovering that sometimes the most important battles begin, not with victory, but with the decision to fight at all. Senator Patricia Hawthorne's congressional office resembled a war room designed by someone who'd never seen actual combat. American flags flanked her mahogany desk, military memorabilia, filled custom display cases, and photographs of her with various generals and defense contractors lined the walls like trophies. The irony wasn't lost on Captain Dave Rodriguez as he maneuvered his wheelchair through the carefully arranged patriotic theater. "Senator," Dave's voice carried the particular dryness reserved for politicians who wore their support for veterans, like campaign buttons. "Thank you for agreeing to meet before the hearing." Hawthorne rose from behind her desk with the practiced smile of someone who'd turned caring into a political brand. 52 years old, former prosecutor, current chair of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and according to Elena's research, a woman who'd voted for veteran benefits exactly 60% of the time. High enough to claim support, low enough to avoid fiscal conservative criticism. Captain Rodriguez, Colonel Cruz, Ms. Cruz Foster. She shook hands with each of them, her grip firm and calculated. "This is a tragedy that demands immediate action when our nation's heroes are subjected to such degrading treatment." "And they cut the speech, Patricia." Dave's interruption sliced through her prepared remarks. "We've all seen your press releases. What we want to know is whether you're interested in actual reform or just political theater." Elena watched the senator's expression shift, the mask of concern replaced by something harder and more calculating. This was the woman who'd built her career on law and order rhetoric, who'd used veteran issues to establish conservative credentials while carefully avoiding any positions that might threaten defense contractor donations. "I resent the implication that my concern isn't genuine," Hawthorne replied, settling back into her chair. "I've been fighting for veterans' rights since before you were making headlines with your radical protests." Tom had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now he leaned forward slightly. "Senator, with respect, what exactly are you proposing? Specific changes, not general principles." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed as she studied the older man. "Comprehensive review of TSA screening procedures, enhanced training for agents dealing with disabled passengers, clear protocols for veteran identification and respectful treatment." "Bureaucratic window dressing," Dave muttered. "Excuse me?" Elena opened her leather portfolio, extracting a thick document. "Senator, we've prepared a list of specific policy recommendations: mandatory training on disability accommodation, independent oversight of screening procedures, civil rights, compliance officers at major airports, compensation funds for passengers subjected to discriminatory treatment." Hawthorne flipped through the pages, her expression growing more guarded with each proposal. Some of these recommendations would require significant budget allocations in the current fiscal environment. "Of course." Dave's smile held no warmth. "Can't let veteran dignity interfere with budget politics." The meeting was interrupted by Hawthorne's chief of staff, a thin man who whispered urgently in her ear. The senator's face darkened as she listened. "It seems your TSA agent friend has been talking to reporters," she said to Tom. "Young Mr. Thompson gave an interview to Rebecca Chase this morning. Very emotional testimony about institutional failures and moral compromise." Elena felt her stomach tighten. They'd agreed that Marcus should coordinate any media appearances with their legal strategy. An uncontrolled interview could complicate everything. "What did he say?" Tom asked. Hawthorne turned her computer monitor toward them, pulling up a Washington Post article dated 30 minutes earlier. The headline read, "TSA agent breaks silence. I was trained to follow rules, not think about people." The article featured a photograph of Marcus Thompson sitting in what appeared to be his living room, his uniform shirt wrinkled, his eyes red with exhaustion or tears. The quotes were devastating. "I joined TSA because I thought I was serving my country, just like my father did in Iraq. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing passengers as people and started seeing them as potential threats. Colonel Cruz wasn't a threat. He was a hero who deserved better than what I gave him. The system doesn't reward agents who use common sense or show human decency. It rewards agents who follow procedures exactly, no matter how stupid or cruel those procedures might be. I've been thinking about my grandfather, who served in Vietnam and came home to protesters spitting on him. Now we have veterans coming home to their own government treating them like criminals. How is that progress?" Elena read quickly through the rest of the article, noting how Rebecca had woven Marcus's personal story into the broader narrative of institutional failure. It was powerful journalism, but it also complicated their carefully planned media strategy. "This could be helpful," Tom said quietly. "The young man is taking responsibility while highlighting systematic problems." "Or it could be catastrophic," Hawthorne replied. "Thompson is clearly unstable. His testimony could undermine the entire hearing, make it look like we're attacking dedicated federal employees based on the word of someone who's obviously having an emotional breakdown." Dave's laugh was bitter. "There it is, worried that actual accountability might interfere with your political grandstanding." The tension in the room was interrupted by Elena's phone. She glanced at the screen, Director Sarah Chen, and made a quick decision. "Director Chen," she answered, "we're in Senator Hawthorne's office discussing the hearing." Sarah's voice was tight with stress. "Ms. Cruz Foster, I need to speak with your grandfather immediately. We have a situation." Elena put the call on speaker. "What kind of situation?" "Agent Thompson has been receiving death threats since his interview was published. People calling him a traitor, threatening his family. He's in protective custody, but he's talking about withdrawing his cooperation with any investigation." Tom closed his eyes, feeling the weight of unintended consequences. A young man's attempt at moral courage was being punished by the same forces that had created the original problem. "Senator," Tom said to Hawthorne, "this is exactly what we're talking about. A system that punishes people for doing the right thing and protects institutions over individuals." Hawthorne's response was interrupted by her chief of staff returning with a tablet showing social media feeds. "Senator, you need to see this. Stand with Thompson is trending. Veterans groups are organizing protective details for the agent. There's a fundraising campaign that's raised $40,000 in 2 hours." Elena watched the political calculations play across Hawthorne's face. The senator was realizing that her carefully planned hearing was becoming something she couldn't control, a genuine examination of institutional failure rather than political theater she could direct. "Director Chen," Tom said into the phone, "patch me through to Marcus. Son needs to know he's not alone in this." As the call connected, Tom found himself thinking about the nature of courage. In Vietnam, courage had been simple. Advance under fire, protect your soldiers, complete the mission. But this kind of courage was more complex, requiring not just physical bravery, but moral clarity in the face of political pressure and institutional resistance. "Marcus, it's Colonel Cruz. I hear you're having a rough day." The young man's voice was shaky. "Sir, I'm sorry. I thought speaking out was the right thing to do, but now everything's falling apart." "Son," Tom said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd led men through genuine darkness, "doing the right thing is never easy, but it's always right, and you're not doing it alone." Through the window of Hawthorne's office, Tom could see protesters gathering on the Capitol steps, some carrying signs supporting TSA reform, others defending federal employees. The personal had become political, the individual trauma transformed into national debate. But in that moment, talking to a scared young man who'd chosen conscience over convenience, Tom Cruise felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pride in the next generation's willingness to fight for principles over self-preservation. The battle lines were drawn. Tomorrow's hearing would determine whether that courage meant anything at all. The Hart Senate Office Building's hearing room buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with normal congressional business. Every seat was filled. Veterans in dress uniforms, disability rights advocates, TSA employees in civilian clothes, reporters armed with cameras and recorders. The overhead lights cast everything in the harsh white of institutional accountability, while C-SPAN cameras captured every gesture for the permanent record. Tom Cruise sat at the witness table, his hands folded with military precision, his Medal of Honor visible on his chest. A deliberate choice by Elena, who understood the power of symbols in political theater. To his left, Director Sarah Chen reviewed her prepared testimony one final time, her composed exterior masking the knowledge that her career hung in the balance. To his right, Marcus Thompson shifted nervously in his chair, the death threats and public vilification of the past 3 days written in the dark circles under his eyes. Senator Patricia Hawthorne called the hearing to order with the theatrical gravity she reserved for moments of maximum political opportunity. The opening statement she'd prepared focused on the need for comprehensive security review. Careful language that promised everything while committing to nothing. "We gather today," she began, "to examine serious allegations regarding the treatment of our nation's veterans by federal security agencies. The incident involving Colonel Thomas Cruise has raised important questions about the balance between national security and human dignity." Behind the press gallery, Elena watched the proceedings with the focused intensity of someone whose professional training had taught her to read power dynamics and political subtext. Dave Rodriguez sat beside her, his wheelchair positioned for quick movement to the witness table when his time came to testify. "Colonel Cruz," Hawthorne continued, "you have served this nation with distinction for over 3 decades. Please tell this committee, in your own words, what happened to you." At Denver International Airport, Tom leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd learned to command attention without raising volume. "Senator, I was traveling to my granddaughter's wedding when my prosthetic leg triggered additional screening procedures. What followed was a systematic stripping away of my dignity in the name of security protocols that seemed designed more to demonstrate authority than ensure safety." The room fell silent as Tom described the screening process, the clinical language that transformed humiliation into procedure, the way institutional indifference could devastate individual dignity. His testimony was neither angry nor self-pitying, which somehow made it more devastating than any emotional outburst. "At what point," asked Senator James Morrison, the committee's ranking Democrat, "did you feel that the screening had become excessive?" "When I realized that my service to this country meant nothing to the system I was encountering," Tom replied. "When I understood that wearing the uniform for 30 years, earning the Medal of Honor, teaching high school students about civic duty, none of that mattered to procedures that treat every passenger as a potential threat." Senator Rebecca Walsh, a moderate Republican from Colorado, leaned forward. "Colonel, do you believe Agent Thompson was acting maliciously?" Tom's eyes found Marcus Thompson, who was staring at his hands with the expression of someone reliving his worst moment. Repeatedly, "No, Senator. Agent Thompson was following protocols designed by people who never have to implement them. He was caught between doing his job and doing what's right, a position no young person should be forced into." When Marcus Thompson was called to testify, his voice shook with more than nervousness. The past week had transformed him from anonymous federal employee to reluctant symbol of institutional failure. Death threats had forced him into protective custody. His mother had been harassed at her physical therapy appointments. The union had distanced itself from his public statements. "Agent Thompson," Hawthorne began, "you conducted the screening in question. Do you stand by your actions?" Marcus looked up, his eyes finding Tom's across the witness table. Something passed between them, the recognition of shared burden, the understanding that truth-telling required courage from both the victim and the perpetrator. "Senator, I followed every protocol exactly as written. The screening was conducted according to established procedures." He paused, gathering himself, "But that doesn't make it right." The committee room stirred. This wasn't the defensive testimony they'd expected from a federal employee facing career destruction. "The system I work within rewards compliance over compassion," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "I was trained to see procedures as more important than people, to treat every variation from normal as suspicious rather than human." Senator Morrison pressed forward. "Are you saying TSA training is inadequate?" "I'm saying TSA training teaches agents to follow rules without thinking about consequences. We're told that security trumps everything else: dignity, common sense, basic human decency. Colonel Cruz wasn't the first veteran I've screened whose prosthetic triggered extensive searches. He was just the first time someone was recording." Director Sarah Chen watched the proceedings with the professional detachment required to survive congressional hearings. But internally, she was calculating the cost of honesty versus institutional loyalty. Her prepared testimony had been carefully crafted to acknowledge problems while defending the agency's mission. Marcus Thompson's brutal candor was forcing her to choose between political safety and moral leadership. "Director Chen," Hawthorne addressed her, "how do you respond to these allegations?" Sarah stood, her uniform crisp, her bearing military straight. For a moment, She thought of her son Tommy, watching from his high school, probably live-streaming the hearing for his debate team. What lesson was she teaching him about institutional responsibility? Senator, Agent Thompson is correct. Our protocols prioritize security compliance over individual dignity. This represents a fundamental failure of leadership, my leadership. The room stirred at her admission. We have created a system that transforms dedicated public servants into instruments of institutional indifference. Hawthorne's expression tightened. This wasn't the defensive, bureaucratic response that would allow her to grandstand about government accountability while protecting existing power structures. Are you acknowledging systematic discrimination against disabled veterans? Senator Walsh asked. I'm acknowledging that our procedures, while technically legal, violate the spirit of dignity and respect that should characterize any interaction between government and citizens, especially citizens who have served with distinction. Elena felt a flutter of unexpected hope. Sarah Chen was choosing institutional reform over career preservation, a rare sight in congressional hearings. The questioning continued for 3 hours, each committee member using the platform to advance their particular political agenda. But beneath the partisan theater, something genuine was emerging, a recognition that individual trauma could illuminate systematic failure, that personal courage could force institutional change. When Tom was called for final questions, Senator Hawthorne made one last attempt to control the narrative. Colonel Cruz, what do you want from this committee? What would constitute justice in your case? Tom looked around the hearing room, at the veterans in their dress uniforms, at Marcus Thompson still struggling with the consequences of moral courage, at Eleanor, whose wedding had been postponed for the larger fight. Senator, I don't want justice. For myself, I want systemic change that ensures no other veteran faces what I faced. I want Agent Thompson to keep his job and receive training that emphasizes human dignity alongside security protocols. I want Director Chen to have the resources and authority to implement real reform, not cosmetic changes designed to survive the next news cycle. He paused, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent serving institutions he'd trusted absolutely. Most of all, I want this country to remember that the people who wore the uniform in service of American ideals deserve to be treated with the dignity those ideals represent. As the hearing concluded, Tom Cruise sat back in his chair, feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized. The truth had been told, completely and without reservation. The consequences, political, personal, institutional, would follow their own logic, but for the first time since Margaret's death, he felt that his life still had purpose beyond memory and regret. 3 weeks after the hearing, Tom Cruise sat in Dr. Maria Santos's office, staring at a box of tissues he hadn't touched, and probably wouldn't need. The room was deliberately calming, soft lighting, earth-tone walls, the kind of careful neutrality designed to encourage emotional honesty. Through the window, Denver's mountains rose against an October sky that reminded him of autumn mornings. In Vietnam, when the air carried both beauty and the promise of violence. You've become something of a celebrity, Dr. Santos observed, her voice carrying the professional warmth that had made her one of the VA's most effective trauma counselors. How does that feel? Tom considered the question with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else. The past month had been a whirlwind of media appearances, policy meetings, and congressional follow-ups. His face had appeared on magazine covers. His testimony had been viewed millions of times online. Veterans organizations had given him awards he'd never sought. Uncomfortable, he said finally. I didn't serve 30 years to become a poster child for institutional reform, but that's what you've become. Dr. Santos leaned forward slightly. The question is whether you can find purpose in that role or whether it feels like another kind of burden. The sessions had been Eleanor's idea, part of her comprehensive approach to healing that included legal action, policy advocacy, and personal recovery. Tom had resisted initially. He'd managed his war trauma for 50 years without professional help, developing the stoic coping mechanisms that had carried him through decades of teaching, marriage, and widowhood. But the airport incident had cracked something open, exposed psychological wounds that had never properly healed. The humiliation hadn't just been about stripped dignity, it had forced him to confront the gap between the America he'd fought for and the one he'd found himself living in. Margaret always said I carried my wars too quietly, Tom admitted. She wanted me to talk about Vietnam, about losing my leg, about watching young men die for reasons none of us fully understood. I thought silence was strength. And now? Tom's laugh held no humor. Now I'm talking to congressional committees about dignity and institutional failure. Margaret would have found the irony amusing. Dr. Santos had been treating elderly veterans for 15 years, long enough to recognize the particular trauma of men who'd built their identity around service to institutions that had failed them. Tom's case was unique only in its public visibility. The underlying psychological damage was depressingly common. Tell me about Marcus Thompson, she said. You've been advocating for him to keep his job, despite what he did to you. Tom thought about the young agent, who'd been transferred to a desk position pending the outcome of congressional reforms. The death threats had subsided, but Marcus remained a lightning rod for both institutional criticism and defense. Some veteran groups wanted him fired. Others had rallied to his support, recognizing him as a scapegoat for larger systematic failures. He's a good kid caught in a bad system, Tom said. Punishing him accomplishes nothing except making us feel better about avoiding real change. Across town, Marcus Thompson was discovering that moral courage came with costs that extended far beyond career consequences. He sat in his mother's living room, helping her with physical therapy exercises while fielding calls from reporters, advocacy groups, and congressional staff members who wanted to use his story for their own purposes. His mother, Linda, had been both proud and terrified by her son's public testimony. Proud that he'd chosen truth over self-preservation, terrified that his honesty would destroy the career stability she'd sacrificed everything to help him achieve. The union rep called again, she said, working through the arm exercises her stroke had made necessary. Says they might be able to get your old position back if you agree to stop talking to the media. Marcus helped her lift her left arm, the one that still struggled with fine motor control. What do you think I should do? Linda studied her son's face, seeing in it the same earnest determination that had driven him to take the TSA job in the first place. I think you should do what your father would have done. What's right, not what's easy. At TSA headquarters in Virginia, Director Sarah Chen was learning that institutional reform required more than good intentions and congressional testimony. The reforms she'd proposed, enhanced training, dignity protocols, independent oversight, faced resistance from field supervisors, union officials, and budget administrators who saw change as threat rather than improvement. Her son Tommy had become an unexpected ally, using his high school debate team platform to organize student support for veteran dignity reforms. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her teenage son understood institutional moral leadership better than most of her professional colleagues. "Oh, Mom," Tommy said during one of their increasingly rare family dinners, "my debate coach says your testimony was either really brave or really stupid. Career-wise, I mean." "What do you think?" Sarah asked. "I think it was both, but mostly brave." Sarah's phone buzzed with another crisis requiring immediate attention. A disabled veteran in Seattle subjected to invasive screening, a viral video, familiar patterns of outrage and institutional defensiveness. The cycle would continue until systematic change, replaced reactive damage control. In Chicago, Eleanor's wedding had been rescheduled for December, transformed from intimate family celebration into something more complex. The guest list now included Marcus Thompson and his mother, Director Chen and her family, Dr. Santos, Dave Rodriguez, and Rebecca Chase. People who'd been strangers 6 weeks earlier, now bound together by shared experience of institutional failure and individual courage. Elena and her fiancé, David, had decided to use their wedding as a fundraising event for veteran advocacy organizations, turning personal celebration into continued activism. It wasn't the romantic beginning they'd originally planned, but it felt more honest, a recognition that personal happiness couldn't be separated from larger social responsibility. "Are you okay with all this?" Elena asked her grandfather during one of their planning sessions. "The wedding becoming a political statement?" Tom looked at his granddaughter, seeing in her face the fierce determination that had made her an effective civil rights lawyer, the moral clarity he'd tried to instill through years of teaching and example. "Sweetheart," he said, "your grandmother and I got married in 1976, right after I came back from Vietnam. That wedding was a political statement too, a belief that love could survive institutional failure, that personal commitment could create meaning in a world that often seemed senseless." As the autumn deepened into winter, Tom found himself thinking less about the airport incident and more about what came next. The trauma would always be part of his story, but it no longer defined him. He'd discovered that healing didn't require forgetting or forgiving. It required transforming pain into purpose, individual suffering into collective action. Dr. Santos had helped him understand that his decades of silence hadn't been strength. They'd been survival. Now, for the first time since Margaret's death, he had something worth breaking that silence for. The work wasn't finished. Institutional change moved with glacial slowness, requiring constant pressure and vigilant monitoring. But Tom Cruise had learned something valuable in his 72 years. Sometimes the most important battles began not with victory, but with the decision to speak truth, regardless of the consequences. Outside Dr. Santos's office, Denver stretched toward the mountains, beautiful and indifferent to human struggle. But inside that room, an old soldier was discovering that some wounds healed only when exposed to light, and that the courage to be vulnerable might be the most important service he'd ever performed for his country. 6 months after the congressional hearing, Colonel Tom Cruise stood before the Veterans Affairs Committee, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to transform personal trauma into institutional accountability. The hearing room was smaller than the dramatic setting where he'd first testified, but the stakes felt higher. This was about implementation, not just acknowledgement. "Committee members," Tom began, "I'm here today not as a victim of TSA screening procedures, but as a veteran advocating for systematic changes that affect thousands of service members every day." The past half-year had transformed him from reluctant symbol into effective advocate. Working with Dave Rodriguez, he'd developed a comprehensive understanding of how federal agencies treated veterans with disabilities. The airport incident had been a catalyst, but the real work lay in the grinding details of policy reform and bureaucratic accountability. Senator Morrison, now chairing a subcommittee on veteran affairs, leaned forward. "Colonel Cruise, what specific changes have you seen implemented since your testimony?" "Some progress, Senator. TSA has instituted dignity protocols for disabled passengers. Enhanced training programs now include modules on respectful treatment of veterans. Independent oversight positions have been created at major airports." Tom paused, consulting his notes, but resistance remained significant at the operational level. In the audience, Elena documented everything with the methodical precision she'd inherited from her grandfather. Her legal practice had evolved, to focus exclusively on veteran rights cases, representing service members who face discrimination in employment, housing, and federal services. The cruise incident had made her a nationally recognized advocate, but more importantly, it had given her a clear mission. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Thompson, TV coverage looking good. Reform training program starts next week. Marcus had become an unexpected ally in the reform movement. After months of administrative limbo, he'd been reinstated to the TSA with a new role developing training programs that emphasized human dignity alongside security protocols. His personal experience with institutional failure made him uniquely qualified to teach other agents about the human cost of rigid adherence to procedures. The transition hadn't been easy. Death threats had given way to professional skepticism, from colleagues who saw him as a traitor to law enforcement solidarity. But Marcus had found purpose in transforming his moral failure into educational opportunity, teaching new agents to see passengers as people rather than potential threats. At TSA headquarters, Director Sarah Chen was fighting battles that never made headlines. Budget meetings where dignity protocols were questioned as unnecessary expenses, union negotiations where training requirements were seen as criticism of existing employees, congressional oversight sessions where political grandstanding replaced genuine interest in reform. Her office walls now displayed letters from veterans who'd experienced improved treatment at airports, small victories that sustained her through larger institutional resistance. But the political pressure remained intense. Senator Hawthorne had never forgiven Sarah's honest testimony, using every opportunity to question her leadership and loyalty to the agency. Tommy's debate team is studying your TSA reforms for their tournament, Sarah's assistant mentioned during a brief break between meetings. He's arguing that institutional change requires both top-down leadership and bottom-up cultural transformation. Sarah smiled, thinking of her son's idealistic determination. Tommy had maintained his intention to join the military after graduation, despite, or perhaps because of, his mother's experience with federal bureaucracy. His generation seemed to understand that serving country sometimes meant challenging the institutions that claimed to represent national values. The afternoon brought a familiar crisis. Another veteran, this time in Miami, subjected to invasive screening that had been recorded and posted online. The video showed an elderly Marine with Parkinson's disease being forced to remove his prosthetic arm for examination, his trembling making the process even more humiliating. Sarah's response team had developed efficient protocols for such incidents: immediate contact with the veteran and his family, investigation of the specific agents involved, review of local training compliance, media response coordinating with veteran advocacy groups. The system was working, but each new case demonstrated how far they still had to go. Rebecca Chase's follow-up investigation had documented 47 similar incidents across 18 airports in the 6 months since. Tom's testimony: the numbers were improving, down from the 63 cases in the 18 months before congressional attention, but each case represented individual trauma that could have been prevented with better training and institutional accountability. Her articles had expanded beyond TSA procedures to examine broader patterns of how federal agencies treated veterans. Department of Veterans Affairs hospitals that required extensive documentation for treatment of service-connected disabilities. Social Security Administration offices that questioned veterans' disability claims with suspicious hostility. Employment. Discrimination against veterans with visible injuries or PTSD symptoms. The investigation had revealed that Tom's airport experience was symptom of a larger cultural problem: institutions that honored veterans in abstract while failing them. In practice, agencies that celebrated military service rhetorically while treating actual veterans with bureaucratic indifference. Dave Rodriguez had channeled his anger into strategic advocacy, building coalitions between veteran organizations, disability rights groups, and civil liberties advocates. His wheelchair had become a symbol of institutional accountability, rolling through congressional hallways and federal buildings, as a reminder that service to country deserved better than bureaucratic contempt. "We're winning the incremental battles," he told Tom during one of their weekly strategy sessions. "Training, programs, oversight positions, dignity protocols, but the larger cultural change, that's generational work." Dr. Maria Santos had seen the transformation in her patients as news of Tom's advocacy spread through veteran communities. Elderly service members who'd suffered similar humiliations in silence were finding their voices, using Tom's example to speak about their own experiences with institutional disrespect. Her practice had expanded to include group therapy sessions for veterans processing public trauma, the unique psychological burden of having private pain become political symbol. Tom attended occasionally, finding strength in shared experience with other veterans who discovered that individual courage could spark collective action. Elena's wedding had taken place in December as planned, but the ceremony had indeed become a political statement. Tom's toast had focused on Margaret's belief that personal love could create meaning in a world often marked by institutional failure, that individual commitment could model the kind of society worth fighting for. Marcus Thompson had attended, with his mother, still uncertain about his future, but committed to the training programs that might prevent other agents from repeating his mistakes. Director Chen had brought Tommy, whose idealistic speeches about institutional accountability had impressed the veteran advocacy community. As spring turned towards summer, Tom found himself thinking about legacy in ways he hadn't since Margaret's death. The airport incident would always be part of his story, but it no longer defined him. He discovered that healing required more than personal recovery. It demanded transforming individual suffering into collective progress. The work continued, measured in small victories and persistent resistance. Congressional hearings that produced actual policy changes rather than political theater. Training programs that emphasized human dignity alongside security requirements. Oversight mechanisms that held federal employees accountable for treating veterans with respect. Standing before the Veterans Affairs Committee, Tom concluded his testimony with words that had become his standard closing. "The America I fought for in Vietnam was an ideal worth dying for. The America I'm working for now is one worth living in, a country that honors service not just with ceremonies and speeches, but with the daily practice of institutional respect for those who've worn the uniform." The ripple effects of one moment of institutional failure continued spreading outward, touching lives and changing systems in ways Tom was still discovering. Sometimes, he'd learned, the most important victories weren't won on battlefields, but in hearing rooms and training centers where individual courage confronted institutional indifference. 1 year after the incident that had transformed his life, Colonel Tom Cruise walked through the same terminal at Denver International Airport, but this time his steps echoed with the measured confidence of someone returning to claim vindication, rather than seeking passage. The irony wasn't lost on him. The place that had stripped away his dignity was now hosting him as the keynote speaker for the TSA's National Training Conference on Respectful Security Procedures. The terminal buzzed with the familiar energy of travelers pursuing their individual journeys, but Tom noticed differences that reflected the year's work. Signs in multiple languages explained passenger rights during additional screening. TSA agents wore new badges identifying dignity compliance officers. A prominent display near the security checkpoint featured photographs of Medal of Honor recipients alongside information about respectful treatment of disabled veterans. Elena walked beside him, her presence both professional and personal, She was here as his legal counsel and family protector, but also as someone who discovered her own calling in the fight for institutional accountability. Her law practice had grown into a small firm specializing in veteran advocacy, with 3 associates and a waiting list of clients seeking justice from federal agencies. "Nervous?" she asked, as they approached the conference center where 500 TSA agents, supervisors, and federal security personnel had gathered for 3 days of training that would reshape their approach to passenger screening. Tom adjusted his tie, the same blue one Margaret had given him, now worn for occasions of significance rather than routine travel. Not nervous, hopeful. The conference center had been transformed into something resembling a military briefing room, with rows of tables facing a podium flanked by American flags and the TSA seal. But the atmosphere felt different from typical federal training sessions, more attentive, more personally invested, as if the assembled agents understood they were participating in institutional transformation rather than mandatory professional development. Director Sarah Chen took the podium first, her remarks carrying the authority of someone who'd survived congressional hearings, budget battles, and political pressure to emerge as a genuine reformer rather than bureaucratic survivor. The past year had cost her politically. Senator Hawthorne had blocked her nomination for Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, but had established her credibility with the agents whose daily work determined whether policies became practice. 18 months ago, Sarah began, this agency failed one of America's heroes. Not because our agents were malicious, not because our procedures were intentionally discriminatory, but because we had created a system that prioritized compliance over compassion, security over human dignity. Tom listened from the side of the stage, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. The months of therapy with Dr. Santos had helped him understand that healing required more than personal recovery. It demanded transformation of the systems that created trauma. His individual pain had become collective purpose, but the work was far from finished. Today, Sarah continued, we hear from Colonel Tom Cruise, whose experience with our agency forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional culture and individual accountability. But more importantly, we hear from someone who chose to transform personal trauma into national service. Again. The applause was respectful but measured, reflecting the complex emotions in the room. Many of these agents had been personally affected by the reforms initiated after Tom's testimony. Some had received additional training they resented as criticism of their professionalism. Others had been disciplined for procedures they'd followed without question for years. A few had been terminated for resistance to new dignity protocols. Tom approached the podium with the careful gait his prosthetic required, but his bearing was straight, his voice strong. Looking out at the assembled agents, he saw Marcus Thompson in the third row, wearing the uniform of a TSA training coordinator, a position created specifically to help other agents avoid the institutional failures that had defined his own experience. "A year ago," Tom began, "I came through this airport as a passenger. Today, I return as a partner in the work of institutional reform. The difference isn't just in how you've chosen to treat me, it's in how you've chosen to treat yourselves." The speech he'd prepared focused on the relationship between individual dignity and institutional integrity, drawing on his military experience to explain how organizational culture shaped individual behavior. But as he looked out at the faces before him, young agents who joined federal service with idealistic intentions, supervisors struggling to balance security requirements with human decency, administrators implementing reforms that challenged decades of established practice, he found himself speaking more personally. "Agent Thompson," Tom said, his eyes finding Marcus in the audience, "would you join me up here?" Marcus hesitated, then rose and walked to the podium with the careful steps of someone still uncertain about his place in the institutional hierarchy. The past year had been challenging. Professional ostracism from some colleagues, public scrutiny of his personal life, the psychological burden of having his moral failure become a teaching moment for national reform. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom continued, "this is what institutional courage looks like. Not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to acknowledge them and work for systemic change." He turned to Marcus, extending his hand. "Son, I want to thank you publicly for something I should have said a year ago. You followed procedures that were flawed, but when you realized the human cost of those procedures, you chose truth over self-preservation. That's the kind of character we need in federal service." The handshake between them lasted longer than protocol required, witnessed by 500 agents who understood they were seeing something rare in government service: genuine accountability leading to institutional transformation rather than cosmetic damage control. The remainder of Tom's speech focused on practical applications of dignity protocols, drawing on examples from military leadership to explain how respect for individual humanity strengthened rather than undermined security effectiveness. But the real impact came from the personal connection he'd established, the recognition that reform wasn't criticism but opportunity, that treating passengers with dignity enhanced rather than compromised the security mission. During the question and answer session, Agent Patricia Williams from Chicago O'Hare raised her hand. "Colonel Cruz, how do we balance respect for passengers with legitimate security concerns?" Tom's answer drew on decades of military experience with checkpoint security in hostile environments. "Agent Williams, real security comes from intelligence, training, and professional judgment, not from treating every passenger as a potential threat. When we approach screening with respect and professionalism, we're more likely to identify actual security risks because passengers cooperate rather than resist." The afternoon workshops broke agents into small groups, working through scenarios that required balancing security protocols with dignity considerations. Tom and Marcus moved between groups, sharing their different perspectives on the same incident, victim and perpetrator finding common ground in the work of institutional improvement. As the conference concluded, Tom found himself in the airport's Veterans Memorial Garden, a space that hadn't existed during his original transit. Elena sat beside him on a bench dedicated to Afghanistan and Iraq war veterans, including her father, whose name was etched in black granite, along with hundreds of others. "Do you think it worked?" she asked. "The conference, the reforms, all of it?" Tom watched passengers moving through the terminal, families heading toward vacations, business travelers pursuing their professional goals, elderly couples visiting grandchildren. The security checkpoint operated with the same efficiency as before, but he noticed different interactions. Agents taking time to explain procedures, supervisors intervening when screening became invasive, dignity compliance officers monitoring for discriminatory treatment. "It's a beginning," he said. "Finally, cultural change takes generations, but individual change can happen in a moment." Today, 500 agents learned that treating passengers with dignity isn't just policy, it's purpose. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Santos. "Saw the news coverage. Proud of how far you've come." The therapy sessions had ended months earlier, but Tom still carried her insights about trauma and healing. His experience at this airport would always be part of his story, but it no longer defined him. He discovered that recovery required more than personal healing. It demanded transformation of the systems that created suffering. As evening settled over Denver, Tom and Elena prepared for their flight back to Chicago. At the security checkpoint, Agent Rodriguez, one of the conference attendees, recognized them and personally ensured their screening was conducted with efficiency and respect. The process took 3 minutes, completed with professional courtesy that acknowledged both security requirements and human dignity. Walking toward their gate, Tom realized that his journey had come full circle. A year earlier, he'd passed through this airport as a broken old man whose faith in institutions had been shattered. Tonight, he was returning home as someone who'd learned that institutions could be repaired by individuals willing to demand better from systems they served. Elena linked her arm through his as they boarded their flight. "Grandpa, I think Grandma would be proud of what you've accomplished." Tom settled into his seat, looking out at the lights of Denver stretching toward the mountains. Margaret had always believed that individual actions could create ripple effects that changed the world, that personal courage could inspire institutional transformation. The plane lifted off, carrying Tom Cruise toward home and whatever battles lay ahead. Below them, Denver International Airport continued its work, processing thousands of passengers each day with procedures that now emphasize dignity alongside security, training agents to see travelers as fellow citizens rather than potential threats. Honor, Tom had learned, wasn't something that could be taken away by institutional failure or bureaucratic indifference. It was something that had to be reclaimed through the daily practice of demanding better from the systems that served the people, and from the people who served those systems. The work continued, measured in small victories and persistent vigilance. But for the first time since Margaret's death, Tom Cruise felt that his life's service wasn't ending. It was evolving into something larger than personal loss, something worthy of the country he'd spent his life defending. Outside the airplane window, America stretched toward the horizon, imperfect but improvable, broken in places but capable of repair by citizens willing to transform their pain into purpose, their trauma into the ongoing work of building a more imperfect union. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.